We chronicle all different levels of people in society, sectors of society, like a group of people you would not want to meet in a dark alley at night if you were hijacking someone's civil liberties. They're the librarians of our country. We have a chapter called Librarians Unbound, and it's about, well, what happened to this group of librarians in Connecticut. A group of them ran something called a library connection, which was all the computers in Connecticut, how they're connected to each other within the library system. And you think about who uses libraries and public libraries. It's usually people who are poorer, who don't have access to a computer themselves. And so they're very vulnerable in a library using a public computer, as George Christian came to learn, who was the executive director of the Library Connection. He was in his office when he got a knock on the door. 2 FBI agents came to the door, and they handed him an NSL. That's a national security letter. When he opened it, it's like being exposed to radioactivity. He wasn't allowed to tell anyone, not a colleague, not a boss, not a friend, not a family member, on pain of 5 years in prison. And it demanded to know information about who was using the internet, the computers, and the library system at a certain time. And he read the letter carefully in front of these FBI agents, looked up, and he said, "I think this is unconstitutional." The FBI agents looked at him pityingly like a predator sizing up his prey, and they handed him their cards, and they said, "You get back to us." He closed the door, and this brave librarian sunk into his chair. Oh my God, he thought, what am I going to do? He says, if I'm going to take on the whole U.S. government, I need at least 4 other librarians. And so he calls up the executive committee of the Library Connection. The first one he calls is Peter Chase. He's head of the Plainville Library in Connecticut. David and I went to visit him. You could tell him from the others because he had that plastic pocket protector. And he grimaced when we brought the coffee into his library. So he calls Peter Chase and the other 3 librarians on his board. Now, Peter Chase, he tells him, I need you in my office tomorrow morning at 9. Do not tell anyone where you're going. We have something very important to discuss. Peter Chase had just gone on this executive committee. They had asked him if he would be willing to serve for a year. They'd give him the position of vice president as a voluntary job. They said, it'll be easy. So Peter's racing there the next morning. As he's driving, he's thinking, what am I doing? He said, did someone not return a library book? Like, did someone misfile an adult book in the children's section? And they show up in the Library Connection office. George Christian is dead serious. He closes the door. There's a lawyer inside. He shows them all the NSL. About, well, over 150,000, probably well more than that, people in this country have gotten NSLs. Maybe someone in this room, and you can't say it if you have gotten one. And the government for years had said that librarians were not getting them, when in fact if you get one you're muzzled, so you couldn't say that you were. He shows them all the NSL, they're all exposed. They cannot tell anyone they have seen this. And they decide together as the lawyer runs out, their pro bono lawyer saying this is way over my head, and tells them to get the American Civil Liberties Union on board. And they do, and they decide to sue the U.S. government to take down the USA Patriot Act. It's not easy. They lose their names. They become John Doe. The U.S. Attorney of Connecticut, who was involved with the serving of these NSLs, is the one who is debating Peter Chase everywhere over the USA Patriot Act. They'd almost go as a couple everywhere. And as soon as this happened, of course, Peter Chase could no longer be identified, so he could no longer debate this anywhere. It became very scary. Ultimately, this was in court. They were told they couldn't go to the Bridgeport court where this was taking place. They were brought to the Hartford court hours away and locked in a security closet. No one was more surprised than the security guard said, I've never locked librarians in a closet before. But in this closet, they saw through closed-circuit television the Bridgeport courtroom. And from the vantage went over the shoulder of the judge. And they were very touched when they saw it packed, row by row, librarians from across the country. They took this case very seriously. They had no choice. They were very afraid of being exposed. The government said they could not, their names could not be revealed. until it was the government who forgot to redact some documents and revealed Peter Chase's name, who had been so diligent about not being on. So AP, I think, and it was the New York Times, called his house. And his kid runs out. They said something about the FBI and a court case and the government and Peter Chase. He says, Dad, a reporter's online. He needs to talk to you about, and he says, son, you never got that call. Dad, are you involved in drugs? He calls his lawyer, and he's chuckling, basically. He says, you're not going to believe this. I have not revealed myself at all. I don't in any way speak out just in case someone were to ask if I am John Doe taking on the USA Patriot Act. And now the government's released the names, and the press is calling. And there's silence at the other end, and the lawyer says, this is not funny, Peter. You leave right now. You leave your house, and I would recommend you don't stay in any house more than one night at a time. They do not know if you called them or they called you. They don't know what you said, even if they know the reporters called you. You have now breached the secrecy around this issue, and you've got to leave. So now these librarians are not only gagged, they're on the run. Ultimately, the USA Patriot Act was renewed. Peter Chase says he would have been testifying before Congress about its dangers, but he couldn't. He was muzzled. And a few weeks later, they had the NSL, the muzzle lifted, and they were allowed to talk about the NSL if there was any question about why they were served with this NSL. As inexplicably as they got this, they were allowed to talk about it. And there are only 4 librarians allowed to talk about this now in the country. They fought back. Like the kids of Connecticut, high school seniors who were putting on their high school play, and they put together a play called Voices in Conflict. And it was putting together the words of soldiers who'd written home, or who'd written letters or who'd made statements when they came home. They didn't think it was a big deal. They were very excited. They always do an annual play. Until the principal came in. This was Wilton, Connecticut. And said, you can make your costumes and you can learn your lines and you can even make the sets, but you're not performing it on the Wilton High School stage. And they said, what are you talking about? He said, no, it's too controversial. And they begged, they pleaded, they were very angry. And he said, that ship has sailed. And that sailed them right onto the New York stage because Broadway theaters heard about the censorship and invited the kids to perform there. And so you had the situation of these kids doing something actors dream of all their lives, to perform on the New York stage. And in the audience, most poignantly, at one of the theaters they performed in was the New York Public Theater, were the soldiers whose words they were dramatizing. And I got a chance at another theater, the Culture Project, to do the talk back with them on the stage, the kids. One of the kids, the stars, was named Jimmy Presser. And I said, do you get a chance to talk about war in class? And he said, well, we do have social studies, and we have to bring in a current event every week, but we're not allowed to bring up the war. And he said, I said, is there anywhere else? He said, well, we have Middle East Studies class, but they're not offering it this year. And then he said, but we can do it in drama. We're doing it through this play, through Voices in Conflict. We had Jimmy and the choreographer. She wasn't political at all. She was just so excited. She was doing this on a New York stage. And their teacher, Bonnie Dickinson, who was threatened with, she definitely would have lost her job, except that there was such an outcry, and the New York Times wrote a piece. And we had them talking, and Jimmy said he couldn't talk about war in class. And afterwards, the choreographer, it was now summer, got a call from her teacher, furious, irate, saying to her, how dare you not correct Jimmy on that show? What was that show anyway? And she said, you mean Democracy Now? She said, what do you mean correct him? She said, I've never been on TV before, and all the lights came on, that lady was just asking us questions, and then the show ended. I hardly even got to say a word. And what do you mean I should have corrected Jimmy? He said, you know you can talk about war in my class. And she said, you mean when the recruiter comes in? Well, interestingly, this piece was written up in the New York Times about what happened. And writer, the playwright, the author, Ira Levin, wrote a letter to the New York Times that got published, the late playwright. He just died a few months ago. And he said he had grown up in Wilton, Connecticut. You know, he's the author of The Stepford Wives. And he said he based The Stepford Wives in Wilton, Connecticut. He congratulated the kids for not being Stepfordized. It's so important not to be Stepfordized, especially in this year, 2008. It could be the most important year in this country's history.